So it's so great to have Professor John Thackara here. And today, actually, I think that in this room, we have mainly two parts of the audience. Half of them, I think, come from my class, Design Frontier. And also we have definitely more audience, which come from outside of my class. And Professor John Thackara is an old friend of Tongji, and he has been a pioneer in the field of sustainability, design for social innovation, etc., etc. And the one most important reason to connect us is we have a sort of a common dream. And he came to Shanghai mainly for design for, at that time we call it rural revitalization. But now we mainly talk the possibility of how countryside can be an engine for rural innovation, right? That's our key. So today, John's the topic of his talk will be designing for life, 50 new jobs that are out there now. So let's warmly welcome Professor John Thackara.
Thank you. Thank you, Lo. So the title is the result of conversations I've had over the last 10, 12 years. So I have a certain reputation as the guy with the positive attitude to the potential for sustainability. And I describe projects that I see around the world, and I meet people who say there is hope, there is the possibility for transformative change. But more and more over the last 10 or 12 years, after I've told my happy-making story on the stage and I go outside, somebody will come and say, "It's a marvelous dream that you've told us about, John, but I need a job." And this lecture is my attempt to listen to you seriously about that question and to say that I can't magically provide you with a job, but there are real jobs out there emerging in many different contexts for which everybody in this room has the potential to become part of. Not that it will be an easy journey, but that if at the end of the hour where I'm going to speak, you feel I have let you down, you can come and throw water at me. But I've tried very hard to look for connections that realistically are a pathway that most of us here could take. My talk is in 3 parts. So I'm going to begin with a few minutes about myself, not because I necessarily like talking about myself, but because my strange and rather indirect history with different experiences may give you the opportunity to decide whether to take seriously what I say. But also because I'm pretty certain that for all of you in this room, your futures will be even more uneven and different and unexpected than mine have been, because we're entering a world in which straight lines through one career are no longer going to be the norm. And so the curious way in which I've navigated change in my life, I think will give you an idea about where you might end up, because I can tell you for sure that I haven't ended up where my father wanted me to end up a few years ago. So, who am I, what am I doing, and why? So I'm an author, I'm a curator, and I'm an advisor. I'm not really a professional teacher, I'm not a professional researcher, and if I have a profession, it's philosopher and journalist, and those are the kind of practices that have shaped my career, as I will explain. Back when I was a student, I was a not terribly brilliant student, but I did study hard about what philosophers had to say. So I spent 4 years having lectures, reading books, and if you can see the incredible attention I paid to this little volume, I don't really understand what I was reading then, let alone why I marked all those pages. But what has stayed with me throughout my life from that period are 2 subjects: the meaning of the word nature and the meaning of the word value. And so I took from my philosophy training, if you could call it that, a curiosity about what those 2 words can mean. And of course, philosophers much more serious than me have discussed that for thousands of years. So it's not as if I have a brilliant solution. But after I did philosophy, I had to get a job. I got a job in newspaper journalism. This was in England at the time. And on my first day in my newspaper office, the editor said, "Ah, Mr. Thackara, I hear you have very fine and elevated ideas about philosophy to share with our readers." I said, "Yes, I'm so keen to help." He said, "Well, let me just give you a reality check. In the newspaper business, the words that you write for our newspaper on one day, people will read them very quickly, but the next day your words will be wrapped around the body of a dead fish. And there's a newspaper, there's a dead fish, and for those of you who've had the fish and chips experience, it's part of the culture that they should be wrapped in newspaper." So that has stuck with me more than my philosophy of 4 years, was that one conversation when I was told, do not regard your words as having some kind of higher value than the moment in which somebody reads them. Think of your words as attracting attention to a conversation, not as something which will last throughout history. So that was the second part of my history that has stuck with my work until today. But with that curiosity about nature, with that curiosity about what is value, it is true that I spent many, many years traveling around looking for examples of real people in real contexts, in very diverse situations and geographies, and basically looking for newspaper stories. Because I was told by my boss, do not write in abstract terms about this subject, write about real people in real places, what they are doing, what is different about what they are doing. And so that is what you see there is a cross-section of encounters I've had all my life with people in the different places meeting their daily life needs in different but often very wonderful ways. For the most part, because I was trained as a journalist for looking something different, I gravitated towards the edges of the mainstream. So without having a plan, I just find myself looking around on the edge of the mainstream for people doing something that might be different. Then I didn't want to just travel around. Now why this is, I'm losing the, oh here there would have been a very beautiful scroll of my blog, but this is not going to happen, which I wrote about started a blog in 1992, just after the internet was started, not long after the wheel was invented. So I've written down the encounters that I had, and my job in writing as an author was, what is interesting about this story that other people might find inspiring for their own work, even if it's not something that they copy. And so I did that for all day, I still do that, but from time to time I would get all the best stories from a few years and put them together in a book or a publication. I realized when I was putting this talk together, roughly speaking, one every 5 years. So I know many of you are contemplating books or have written books. As you know, it's absolutely a terrible and horrible thing to do, but it's very good when you've done it. And so I've done a book every 5 years that, in one way or another, they're not a theoretical book, they're a collection of the encounters I've had with people doing things differently, which if you add them all together, is quite an interesting and diverse landscape. I'm especially thrilled that 3 of those books have been published into Chinese. Thank you for Tongji and Professor Lo for the middle one, which was published first. In some way that I don't yet totally understand, the books in Chinese have not come out in chronological order. So the one on the left I was given 6 months ago, which I actually wrote in 1987, and the one on the right I wrote in, anyway, it's one of these mysteries. I assume that China operates on a more sophisticated time scale than the West, and that things don't have to go in a particular order to make sense. But we go and visit projects, I meet people leading projects, and then for a period of 15 years I organized a conference in Amsterdam called Doors to Perception, to which I would invite people to come and speak who had an interesting story to tell. It was a very cool conference. It was a bit like the European TED. Lots of people, 1,000 people sitting in a big darkened room, a bit like this. They were exciting times, and after about 8 years we moved it to India and did the same kind of thing there, because our subject, which was social innovation, technology and transition, it just made more sense to have that discussion in India, which is a much more complex and messy but also exciting place, to try and understand the landscape of systems from within the system rather than in Amsterdam, which is a bit like a kind of playground. So yes, we learned a lot, but at the end of the day, those conferences were a bit like you are now. They were sitting, watching somebody else speak and present. There was not so much interaction until afterwards between the people to discuss what they just heard. So from about 2007 onwards, I started to organize social innovation festivals of much smaller scale, which were about principally the people leading a project coming to meet each other to say, what are you doing? Here's what I'm doing. It was very much more of a peer-to-peer environment, and it was just 10 times better energy on the smaller scale than when you have a bigger room with show business and rock stars from the internet and so on. This was one we did in Northeast England. Here's one I did in France called City Ecolab, and that was, again, to demonstrate for the purposes of my host that actually there's a lot more happening in your own backyard than you probably realize. So when one is given the fun job of doing a biennial, they normally expect somebody like me to bring my friends from other far parts of the world and to show some exotic object that they can look at. I did the opposite of that. I said, we're going to have a 50-kilometer limit around this event, and all the projects are going to come from within our own vicinity. This, by the way, is when I first met Professor Lowe, which you could see. I put his picture there. And I remember briefly saying to him, please, can we do one of these in China? And he said, well, I'll see what I can do. And so some years went by. I'll tell you about that in a moment. The point being that the value of this event was not as a spectacle. It was not show business. It was not promoting anything. It was a place for people to come to meet, to help each other. So yes, there was quite a lot of visitors, but the principal value was in the project leaders and the pioneers from the edges of the normal system meeting each other for the first time. And the value they got there, I've heard so many times, was I thought I was the only one doing this. And then they would discover 80, 90 other people doing interesting things that were not famous, not above the radar, and so on. So this notion of giving a voice, giving visibility to people who are out there on the edges, small scale doing the work, it's so powerful, but I'll leave it at that. But even there, we were in a room, big rooms, small rooms. I thought, where is the context? Where do these people come from? And it's because they have these amazing stories to tell. What could we do to maybe go to the source? So for a period of years, and more or less till now, I've tried as far as possible with other colleagues to go into the rural areas and say, okay, what's happening here? This is in the middle of Sweden, a project called Back to the Land 2.0, did several years. What you see in that picture is some students, municipal officials, some farmers, people running the local projects, and we would spend 5, 6, 7, 8 days, not always as sunny as that, I must say, if there's anybody who knows Sweden, but anyway, in principle, we would just talk amongst ourselves about what are you doing, what's going well, what's not going so well, and by the way, could the input of designers be helpful to what you do? And they said, we like help from anywhere, from designers would be excellent. So we would have very informal design workshop type activities, not to make formal proposals, but just to kind of reflect back and enhance the work that the project leaders themselves were doing. But our work as visitors, absolutely crucially, was shaped by and informed by the context that we were in. We were in their context, not them coming to our context. And I think that's what people have called embodied relationships, relationships in a place, one body to another, breathing the same air. It's pretty much the quality threshold that I think shapes what we're going to be doing in the future. Flash forward a couple of years, and then Professor Lowe fulfilled his promise and invited me to help him with the Zhangyang Country Living Festival. And we had this huge space, but the basic principle was the same. Bring to this space people who were doing projects of an innovative nature that involved new ideas, but most importantly, new combinations of people. And I was most proud, my main contribution to this whole event was the herb tunnel that you see there from Biofarm here in Shanghai. I said to one of my collaborators, could we have a herb tunnel? This is what I learned about how amazing China is. And my colleague made 2 or 3 contacts on her phone, and the next day, all these pots of herbs came, some magical material to put the pots in, and it was all done within 24 hours. So that's when I realized that China was a different sort of place. Anyway, the point is, so you go into this mélange of projects with the smell of fresh herbs as your main sensory input. So I was just very happy about that. That brings us kind of until now. And last year, some of you must know about this, we had the publication of the Design S Manifesto. And it basically, from my sort of perspective, it kind of concludes an evolution of ideas and practice which has been brewing for quite a long time. But basically you have what has become, I guess, the world's #1 design city, making this statement called Shift of Design Focus Towards a Web of Life Framework, which is, it sounds innocuous, but it's actually rather radical if you look at the history of design in terms of its origins in the industrial age, the kind of all the different things that have happened in the design world in terms of its growth and complexity, to say that as far as Shanghai and our ecosystem is concerned, our priority is to serve the web of life. This is not a small change. It didn't just happen in this document. It's basically the result of lots of small changes which have been happening, which is a kind of a metaphor for my own journey. So that's the story. That's for you to judge whether or not to take the next bit seriously. But as I said at the beginning, I want to describe very quickly, and not in great depth, jobs that are happening out there in which people with design backgrounds of one kind or another are making a material contribution. To introduce those 50 jobs, let me just do 3 themes that run through all of the things that I can describe. 3 cross-cutting themes which crosses these job ideas, but also the probably 40-odd years that I've been finding out about what's been going on. Cross-cutting theme #1 is that the well-being of people and the well-being of nature are a single story. Of course it is. But the mysterious thing is we've organized the modern economy, the global sort of infrastructure and everything else as if they are separate, and that's why we have the difficulties that we do have. If we just starting today, stop separating those 2 things together, many, many questions become simple, especially to do with the priorities. The priority is yes or no, does the project or the job I'm doing leave nature healthier? If not, it's probably not the right thing to be doing. I'm not suggesting that that's an easy choice to make, but at least it's clear after so many decades of unclarity. Cross-cutting theme #2 is the importance of place. The thing about place is that we've all had the difficulty of how do you get people to collaborate who might wildly disagree with each other. They might be business people or policymakers or activists or old people or young people. The world is filled with people who do not agree with each other. But what we all probably do agree is that we would like our place to be healthier than it is now. If you put it like that and keep it simple, that is actually something that people can, yeah, of course we do. Then, if you say the health of place, the vitality of place is the thing that unites us, then one can work through courses of action, starting small, that begins to get people who might not otherwise have worked together to understand, oh, actually, I have more in common with this other guy than I realized. The proviso here, which is what I've mainly learned working here in China, is that over 10 years of looking for forms of rural life that maybe urban people could drop everything and go and work in the countryside, nobody is going to do that. Nobody can do that. And by the way, I think it's 300 million people come from villages to the city to work. So yes, place is the crucial dimension here, #2, but rural-urban is itself a place. So the quality of moving backwards and forwards is something that is not fixed geographically in the world that we are now in, rather than the idealized world that some people might want to describe. Urban-rural is itself a place. We can work through that. And then #3, now this is where it's a PDF, so all my beautiful moving worms are not moving. Anyway, the point is that what is the relationship in this transition between technical and social infrastructure and the web of life that I mentioned that we wrote in the manifesto? The answer is just decide as a simple matter of ethical choice that social technical infrastructures are at the service of life, which is kind of what we reached at in the manifesto. How you do that? Well, a million possible answers, but let's just say that's the principle, that's the ethical starting point. That makes so much easier choices about AI, about automation, about networks, and so on. Yes or no, does this proposed application leave the world a healthier place? Is there more vitality as a result of this AI application, as a result of its introduction? Yes or no? Yeah, that's the answer. So, some jobs. Starting with the most obvious ones, which is the world of green infrastructure. And I don't know how many people here are involved with projects to make their neighborhood healthier or go on camps or whatever. What I've discovered to my own astonishment is that if you look around the world, in particular, places like the US, which is thought to be the source of all pollution and destruction, ecological restoration in the USA employs more people than coal mining, logging, or steel production combined. That's like a rather large amount of what they call smokestack industries. Ecological restoration today employs more people than those do. Now, I'm not suggesting that as a designer you go immediately and start becoming a mining restoration expert, but I can tell you, and I'm going to explain as I go through this list, that every single one of these activities, as well as an ecological or technical or civil engineering dimension, has a social and a cultural and an ecological dimension. And I guess my core proposition here is that the design practice has the capacity to connect these different things together in ways that almost no other profession can do. So I think the designers will be the ones that connect these social agendas and the cultural and ecological agendas to what otherwise look like big, heavy engineering projects. So land care, soil care, forest care, river care, desert care, tree care. Gigantic numbers of people are involved in these activities today. I would say most of them are top-down projects in which somebody said, we must clean up that river, we must restore the mine, we must do all sorts of very good things, but it's a sort of production mindset in which the social and the cultural aspect is not always given priority. And that's where I think we are going to add tremendous value. And by the way, I have to keep replacing this. Many of these projects are looking for the skills that I'm describing that designers have but don't know where to find it, probably because they don't ask for designers. They just say, we need a coordinator, we need an integrator, we need a sort of a process person to pull these bits together. Very often, they need a designer. As well with all those restoration projects in which people physically repair landscapes, you probably know better that there's a rather vast world of Earth observation, already pretty mature. Satellites, AIs, 101 forms of sensors, from the microscopic to the planetary scale. Now, to be realistic, most of the economic power behind Earth observation is from the defense and mineral and extractive industries. Let's not be naive about it. However, at the same time, I would say a big chunk of Earth observation is stuck at the moment with the proposition, we have all this data, but what do we do with it? How do we activate this data in a way that we actually, as well as looking at the Earth, make it healthier on the ground, so to speak? This is a rather huge opportunity in terms of innovation in the form of turning information, data and technology into something which creates positive value. I have a friend who works at Planet Labs, you may have heard of, which is one of these big sort of top-down looking at the planet from above. They make good money selling their data to mining companies in the defense sector, but they're completely frustrated by their disconnect from educators, from activists, from the people at municipal level who could use this data and don't at the moment. So the Francesca's lab here, the Ecology and Cultures lab here in Tongji, that's one of the areas where they're working in. How do you create citizen-level participation that uses the data from this kind of gigantic Earth observation sector, but applies it very locally on the ground? I'm providing you with a question rather than a simple answer, but there's so much work to be done there. This is my favorite, slightly niche example from the world of Earth observation, is the subterranean bioacoustics. So this is a Romanian artist and consultant called Jo Brzezinska. Her work, and she is paid to do this, is to take sonic samples for the land underneath vines and to tell the farmer, yes or no, is the soil healthy, based on the activity and the sound made by the activity in worms and other microscopic creatures. Now, I'm not saying everybody in this room can become a paid bioacoustician, but it's a rather cool niche job if you're already interested in that world. So that's, we did earth repair and earth observation, the kind of big picture, rather top-down. I want to go to the sort of really, it's the most unlikely, but also I think where the biggest opportunities are going to lie, namely the universes of soil care. Now, because it's a PDF, you're not seeing my magical picture. I personally knew nothing about soil. I wasn't interested until about 8 years ago when I saw this animation by a man in America, an ecologist called Julian Lieber, who makes these mycorrhizal fungi cross the forests underneath what I thought were dead leaves. There is a universe of life underneath the apparently dead floors of forests, but also in cities, in which is the potential for tremendous progress in making our soils healthier. Why does this matter? Because soil, I think people are beginning to get it, it's not no longer a controversial subject, is a source of wealth and prosperity more than purely artificial environments. Soil is the basis of life. No soil, no food, no people, no economy, no Shenzhen. But the point is that we haven't until now had the infrastructures of, let's say, let's look for soil care as a positive economic contribution. But that is where the social and the cultural is now driving change to an extraordinary degree. So what you're seeing is city and municipal governments saying, okay, never mind, in the countryside we understand farmers, agroecology, natural farming. Yes, they will look after soil because that's their business. But cities now compete and consider themselves to be successful or not successful on whether they are healthy places to live and to work. And cities are beginning to understand a healthy city depends on the health of the soil that we are sitting on. What do we do about that? Good question. So the notion of municipal and urban soil care as a form of infrastructure is becoming a serious investment, and I'll show you some examples in a moment. I just wanted to mention the three words there, rhizosphere, phylosphere, and hydrosphere. If you decide to drop everything today and to go into soil care, you can divide your career into 3 bits. So the rhizosphere is everything happens with the mycorrhizal networks in the soil, their health. The phylosphere is all the leaves of all the vegetation in a city, and the life on leaves of growing plants is an incredibly rich source of information, but also how you actually look after plants, and better or not so well. And the hydrosphere, I guess, is more obvious, is what happens in the water. The point is that this is already started on the edges of our normal world. This is a picture from Western Australia, where they're doing very serious work on mining restoration. Now, mining justifiably has a pretty terrible reputation, but what's not so well understood is that most mining concessions have in their contracts clauses saying that when you finish mining, you have to make good the land that you've spent 20 or 30 years destroying or damaging. So they have a legal obligation to spend quite significant resources on restoration. And the next generation of restoration of mining areas says not just, so to speak, fill in the hole, but bring back some elements of the ecosystem that were here before we came in with our machines and dug it all up. And this is where the whole subject of recreation of ecosystems based on fairly advanced science becomes interesting. So, to cut a long story short, eDNA metabarcoding gives you the possibility to discover what sort of life was there before the mining, not just plants, but creatures, microorganisms. You can get a rather good picture, and not that you then recreate it as it was before, but it gives you a very rich tapestry of the things that you can do to create life which is appropriate to that place. Now, the design angle here is that information needs to be organized. It's an inherently multidisciplinary process. all sorts of different kinds of people need to be involved and are being involved in these mining restoration projects. Brazil has got, 20 or 30 amazing. Is anybody from Brazil here? Anyway, Brazil is a world leader. Go and find out. But this is my favorite example. It's a European project, city of Lille, which is a classic middle-sized post-industrial city. It had several generations of industry, rather toxic processes of industrial production. But the city fathers of Lille have said, we will not accept just being left to rot in our poisoned land. We want to be a healthy city. How do we therefore make our city healthier, including our soil? Which is where a rather amazing ecologist called Jermaine Moulemans comes in. He is looking at techniques for the many, many different ways in which bits of soil in that, as you can see, terribly damaged and polluted environment can be improved in their health. It's multidisciplinary in which the participation of citizens, the participation of local businesses, municipal officials all have to be coordinated. And that, to me, is a design job, and indeed for them, they say we need somebody to coordinate and provide kind of clarity to this complicated activity. There's also a research element to it. These are some colleagues in Scotland who are saying, how do we make soil care, less kind of boring, and how can we make it more interesting? I'm just going to leave that there because I'm running a bit late. But just as final evidence that there are actual paid jobs in urban soil care, this is a group, an organization in New York City, of all places, called the Urban Soils Institute. The people in that picture, 3 of them have a job, 2 of them are researchers, and 1 of them, I think, is a volunteer. The Urban Soils Institute does soils testing, education, physical kind of database collection, and so on. And they are funded by the US Department of Agriculture. And they even survived the Musk sort of triage of all this work. But the management of the city of New York says, if we are going to be a healthy city, global center of business and activity, we have to be a healthy city. So the Soils Institute for them is an essential infrastructural funding activity. And you can then tell me which bit of that work, soils testing, education, have as a design element. The answer is all of them in different ways. Another subject is depaving. So imagine that all the soil in the world that is covered in asphalt and concrete could be set free, something that activists have said for 20 years, free the soil. Freeing the soil is no longer a kind of slogan of activity. It has become a mainstream activity of cities. It started in Portland, Oregon in 2008 when the depave movement did indeed begin with the activists kind of illegally digging up car parks outside shopping malls and hotels and so on. But fast forward to 2020 and the city of Chicago, the Windy City, one of the most car-based cities in the world, said we are going to make depaving a priority. And what you see here is people depaving the asphalt car park outside a school, in which the school principals, the parents, the students are doing work as volunteers, but there are professionals in terms of scientists testing the soil, designers organizing communications and teams and so on. It's not a traditionally obvious thing, but the point is that it's no longer fringe. And this blew my mind last week. A report called Depave Los Angeles 2025, a quite amazing piece of research by some people called Spherical, who are basically a design information company working with geographers and others, have done a kind of square meter by square meter survey of the whole of Los Angeles County and have discovered, to rush forward, that 312,000 acres of Los Angeles, I think it's 1.8 million mu, something like that, are not functionally necessary. They're not really needed. So Los Angeles, of all places, with this report to start with, is now going to start depaving itself. And depaving is not just sending in machines, it's organizing quite complex process, block by block, school by school, house by house. It's very much a kind of project management and physical and information activity in which the coordination of the citizens is very important. Check it out. I'm not going to spell out what the design roles in there. They all need designers. Related to that, and this is where we overlap with soil health and water health, a project called Living Infrastructures, a whole systems approach to watershed health, again by Spherical and a company group called ALA, working with the municipal authorities of the Los Angeles County. What they have done is to say, well, we spent 50 years trying to protect our cities from flooding by building massive concrete structures that in many cases have made things worse. But all the scientists and the ecologists and the people who know say we need to do things on a much more micro level. We need small-scale interventions, almost at the level of individual houses. That's how nature works, so that's how we should adapt to climate change and the danger of flooding. But how do we get the average citizen to take any interest or let alone participate in intervening in their street? Anyway, what they've done is to create this infrastructure of data layers, sources of information across the city. Oh, this isn't going to work out. I should never have done it with a PDF. On there, you will see, in a perfect world, all those marks start to move around. So what the platform does is if you're a citizen in your house, you can look up your street, and when it's raining or when the rain is of the forecast, see where the flooding occurs, almost to within a few yards. Then you can then contact your fellow citizens in that block, in that neighborhood, in your street, and say, shall we dig a rain garden? Shall we plant some trees? What can we do to stop this water accumulating and causing us damage? And then when it becomes magical, you can then, the system, the platform, translates your micro-level proposal into a grant application to the city, which has something like 70 different pots of money to get money for small projects to do with improving your neighborhood, and it kind of translates the language into the language that the system can. This is where the LLMs come in. It takes your wish to dig a rain garden in your street and turns it into a grant application that can be funded. So the city already has something like $300 or $400 million available to spend on this activity, but finds it so hard to find ways of giving that money to small-scale projects. And this is, to me, pretty central to what designers are really good at, is translating either technical or administrative logic and information into something which citizens can understand, and then having a two-way process at the end of which people start to make their street healthier. So we've done earth and earth care and think waters. Professor Lowe and I went to a conference in London a few months ago called, Our Water Cities. And it was so fascinating to hear that different cities of the world are really taking seriously the notion that flood control is a very old paradigm. We don't want to just build massive structures to keep water away. This is the bad side of climate change. Cities ranging from the local water side up to regional governments want to have multidisciplinary, multifunctional ways of relating to water. And in many different parts of the world, people, like I said with Lille, where they said don't be defeated about how bad your situation is. Places where the water is really bad, people, including designers, are saying, let's see what we can do with a multidisciplinary approach to make things better. This is some friends of mine called Herbs in Mumbai, who for many years now have collaborated with local citizens, fishers, municipal officials, and they've said, okay, this river is really in terrible condition. Can we please find out where the pollution comes from? Can we work with the people who are responsible for the pollution? Are there physical interventions we can make? Are there scientific interventions? Now, it's not the case that they've magically cleaned up the rivers and the watersheds of Mumbai, but they have created the dialogues and the platforms and the alliances which are the precondition for that to happen. Go back to New York, and I think the most extreme example I know of designers getting involved in toxic water is this Gowanus Canal, which some of you may have heard of. It's probably the most polluted bit of water in North America. It's next to the airport, it's next to manufacturing, it's next to all sorts of people putting poisonous stuff in the water. Their work involves a combination of social innovation, of getting people to accept that they have a responsibility to stop polluting the water, together with interventions to make the water physically cleaner. And so they're working with fairly cutting-edge science, which again is quite advanced here in China, about what they call hyperaccumulators, which are almost invisible microorganisms that, if chosen correctly, if curated correctly, can consume the toxins in water. Now, they have not magically cleaned up the Guaymas Canal, but they are responsible for a coalition of businesses, airports, municipal officials, citizens, people running apartment buildings that are broadly agreed we're going to do what we can to clean up the canal. I have to put this is my town in France. So whilst I was here in China, we were cleaning up our river, which is actually a bit cleaner than the Guaymas Canal. But we have all over Europe tens of thousands of groups of people who are several times a year meet to put trash into plastic bags. That is the citizen energy which exists now today. If people want to do something, practical acts of care. So in my village, that's what they were doing last weekend. They work with the municipal authorities, with the people running the rivers, with the trash organizations. It's pro-citizen business. And I'm not saying it's kind of heavily designed, but there is a design element in the coordination of what they do. Coming back to China, so on my last trip here just before Christmas, I was just amazed. This is after we went to this conference in London. I said, well, what is China doing on watershed recovery? 4,300 wetland restoration projects have been completed in China in the last period. That's quite amazing. World champions, very easily. I don't suppose many of you know that much. How many of you know that fact? Zero, right. It's kind of top down, region by region. It's very kind of brilliantly coordinated, but at the end of the day, it's like a sort of, the system says we're going to do it, and the system then responds at the level of physical restoration. So it's a miracle, but it's only half of the potential, because physically restoring a watershed puts back the elements that were physically damaged by modernity. But the second side of the subject is what about human activity, the social and cultural ways that we live that caused us to damage the watersheds in the first place. And that's where the notion of design as a coordinator between multiple different forms of restoration becomes so interesting. So this is, I don't know if you see a check here, no. Anyway, so this is one of the postdocs here in Tongji, in Stadex, who I met last year, spent several years in Fujian province, learning what does it mean to restore an oyster reef. So there are oyster reefs all over the world. There's rather a lot of designers who say, I'm going to design some reef and put it in the water and save the oysters. And so they use 3D printing or Lego bricks or whatever, ceramics, and they put things into the water as if that was going to restore the oyster reef. But what Jack and his colleagues discovered, together with the citizens, the municipal authorities, the people running the temple, is that there are 5 degrees of participation needed to restore an oyster reef. There's a social dimension, an ecological one, a cultural one, a physical one, that's the physical one there, and the economy of it all. Read the papers, I hope you can see that. It's a very, very complex story in which service design, design strategy, economic aspects, cultural and ecological expertise have all been brought together. Now, it doesn't have a happy ending because the funding stopped, but the point is, this is where the future lies, where everybody understands who's been involved in reef restoration, or versions of it. We need people to coordinate multiple levels of action. And those people, to my satisfaction, and when I see them actually happening, are basically designers. A few words about food. It's always dangerous as a speaker to talk about food just before people have eaten, so I won't spend more than a few minutes on this. But I've been involved and learned about food projects for the best part of 30 years. And I'm guessing that people here know that we have problems with the world's food systems. The best way I could, and you wouldn't be happy if I kept on talking for 3 hours, but there's a lot of interesting things to be said and learned about food systems. Many, many forms of design intervention have been happening over the last years. If you think that food is somewhere where you would like to invest your expertise, one way to think about it is this kind of picture of the subsystems of food systems. That is to say, where food is grown and produced, the processing that is done to food, the distribution, the access of hungry people to food, consumption and waste in particular. Those are, so to speak, subsystems of food, systems which are not working well at the moment. So there are tens of thousands of projects around the world in which designers are involved in redesigning everything from food waste systems to farming and so on. I'll just give you a couple of quick examples of a whole variety of things which are happening out there and which I've been learning about over the last, 15 years. For example, farm-to-table design, changing the relationship between the people who grow the food and the people who eat it. I showed you all those subsystems. For the best part of 10, 12 years, people have been looking ways to bring the farmer in direct contact with the person who eats their food. This is a group in England called the Open Food Network, but there are many more. This is one of the highlights of that show that we did in Shenyang, the Urban Rule, is the streaming platforms, which China leads the world in that. And you have, I think 30, 40 million farmers are now, in one way or another, doing streaming activities of one sort or another with the big networks as participants. The point is that there's a whole world of work to be done to help farmers get online, if they want to design forms of interaction, forms of communication. So this is service design in very kind of different complex ways. And it's not just about transactions. I think the main problem is that the big, the Alibabas and the JD.coms will help you make a transaction platform. They're not so interested in how can the farmer have a better relationship with his customers or her customers through time. So that, to me, is the next generation of using the streaming potential, is changing the social relationships between the people who work on farms and the people who don't. A third and pretty dramatic future opening up now is that food growing in cities. I don't know how many of you were aware, I know that not many of you are aware, because I've had this conversation before and in other places, that even today, between 15 and 20% of global food is produced in urban and peri-urban environments. In most cities, they see food growing as something that poor people do, or that we did in our past when we were farmers, and this is not something that modern, high-tech, modern cities or city regions do. That is changing in a big way, because cities are realizing two things. One is, in the kind of chaos of the world at the moment, they cannot rely on global supply chains to feed their citizens, and everybody knows that's dangerous. But more importantly, policy people now understand that there are benefits to urban food beyond just calories that they can feed people with. There are social benefits, there are cultural benefits, there are public health benefits. There are lots of ways in which the proximity to food growing and all over modern, high-tech, advanced cities is suddenly, in a very kind of wonderful way, becoming important. So in France, where I live, we've had 12 years in which people have said, how do we connect urban farming with the citizens in new ways? And all these lessons are now coming together, and this is a designed kind of a toolkit for cities. How do you improve your urban farming infrastructure? Not just as physical spaces, but all the 101 things that need to be done to make food farming not just efficient in economic or calorie terms, but social benefits and cultural benefits as well. This is some of you may have heard me talk before about the bio-canteen movement. It's quite a miracle. Ag-tech. Shanghai is super keen on agri-tech. The whole of the world is super keen. Wherever you find engineers and scientists, the agri-tech is marvelous. Agri-tech is a bit marvelous, but agri-tech is completely a sort of short-term bubble at the moment, in which the lesson that I keep repeating is that technology has long-term value to the extent that it serves life. Not that it extends the bubble economy or the startup economy, to the extent that it supports life. So yes, agri-tech is important, but we need to make the correct choices about where it's going to be used. And this is where I can give you some very practical advice about, if you're keen on agri-tech, great, but talk to the people who are expert about what the farmers themselves actually need. So this is, I've shown this story many times. How do you manage a compost system in food waste in a city? answer. Complicated story, but you need to know the temperature of the compost heap so that you can decide whether to manage it on a day-to-day basis. So some people at MIT invented a distributed compost sensor program. That is an example of an innovation based on talking to the people doing the composting and the waste management. And on the left here, you can see some of the organizations around the world that are the grassroots farmers getting together to do the development and the innovation. There's in fact a network called the Grassroots Innovation Assembly, which represents, I don't know, nearly 1 billion small farmers around the world. That is the place to go if you want to find what farmers think they need. They need lots of tools and equipment, don't get me wrong. What they do not need is big tech companies selling them some very exotic, expensive robotic AI weeding machine, which will never work. And just here, a few weeks ago, you had one of the networks in China that has incredible knowledge about what farmers need. The community-supported agricultural movement, which after, again, 10, 15 years of slowly growing, is now growing quickly. More and more farmers getting involved with changing their practices, are migrating from industrial farming to natural farming. If you want to know where the knowledge is about what's needed in terms of technology or other systems, go and talk to those guys. I'm coming to the end of my jobs. I'm not giving you one by one, but let me just finish. I know some of you are involved in the NICE project here in Shanghai, just next door. How do you revive a neighborhood? It's kind of it's not actually an easy question. Then when I was here last time, I saw this in the newspaper, step up rural revitalization efforts. So the government, the leaders of the country want this work to be done with more intensity and more creativity. What does this mean for you and your work as designers? I don't live here, so I can't give you step-by-step instructions, but I can tell you what's happening in Europe, where designers have said, yes, we can be part of rural revitalization. What you see here is a group of about 15, they're mostly design people, but they include a couple of municipal officials, arriving at a small hilltop village in the south of Italy, called Grottoli, which is half dead, but not completely dead. It needs to be revitalized. Most of the young people have left and gone to the city. Familiar story. What they did, and what these kinds of people do, is to look at what appears to be a dead or a semi-moribund town and say, actually, wait a minute, maybe there is qualities and people and activities here that we could work with. And so, to cut a long story short, the Open School for Village Hosts is a movement now spreading to many different regions and countries in which people go and say, let's not just make assumptions about what needs to be done to this village. Let's identify and connect with people in this village who have potential when they're related to each other. So on the right, you see what we found in that apparently abandoned village. People with cooking skills, spaces, groups of people with all sorts of enthusiasms, which had potential for social and economic activity, but were at the moment not connected. The work involves making systems and networks that which people work with each other who had previously been separated. This is Henrietta Wahl, who's another one of our collaborators, who said, there is no village in the world where you can't create new value and new quality if you only just start to connect people up in novel manner. And the one that most famous in Italy was, this is not a business, but we were paid by the regional government to do a festival of cooking by the elder women of the community. And it's food in Italian, and therefore it's a happy-making story. It connects generations to each other. It gives people visibility who are otherwise ignored and not respected. And it was just a very wonderful, it's not a major economic benefit, but it's a major social and cultural benefit to that village. But I wanted to say that because the crucial role in this work is not paid by designers coming in and organizing this stuff on somebody else's behalf. The crucial role is played by people in the communities who are already there, who maybe work on their own, who maybe are just doing small projects outside the limelight, below the radar. We call them village hosts, but the words don't matter. The individuals who are the lifeblood of most communities, who need and could benefit from help and support and connectivity, new relationships. And that's where the designer process comes in to say, what do they need to do more of their work, to do it better, and so on. I'm going to finish with 5 minutes on the story so far and why I'm here this week, which is to work with the colleagues on design harvests, because this is where we are learning the lessons of the last 20 years of what rural revitalization can mean. So I don't know about some of you being involved since the beginning, most of you not. It's going back till 2008, I believe that's the correct date, when groups of designers went to Tongji Island, would do workshops, would have pleasant experiences and begin to know what this exotic rural location was about. They, over a period of time, made maps and diagrams representing all the assets of that community that perhaps were not so visible to the visitor coming from outside. It was the beginnings of what I like to call the bioregionist campus. Everything they did in going to that island and making their explorations and meeting people was a form of learning, a form of experimentation. So the fact that they can make this extraordinary sort of landscape of people with farmers, people with skills, people with children, carers, whatever, those are, if you like, the actor map with the before. What comes next is, how do you then turn these separated and maybe disaggregated assets into a more vibrant rural situation? The answer was, well, not easily, but when that period of work gave us an idea, an understanding of potential. There's very large numbers of rural occupations that people are already doing, but which can be enhanced and transformed with the participation of designers. You probably can't read that, but we made a list for that big show of the rural jobs that we had identified that somebody was doing somewhere in China, which we thought were examples of something that could be learned from and replicated and borrowed from other people. So it was a kind of a to-do list in which we said, here is what's happening, how other villages and how other rural communities can benefit, we don't actually know. But what we had by that time, an understanding that rural revitalization with design involved is not a sort of global model that you apply as if it's like, I don't know, designing a road or something. It's multi-dimensional, multi-sectoral, multi-temporal, different time scales, different geographies. So yes, I do recommend you take a picture of this because I don't think I have time to go through it line by line. Those are activities that can be found by designers employed either by the project or by the municipality or by whatever, participating in rural revitalization. And that brings us to the work we did on Monday of this week. So we went with a group to Town, an hour from here or so, which is a potential site for the next generation of this kind of experimentation. And remember, learning the lessons of the previous years since 2008. And what you see in that picture is 44 people, of whom 3/4 were in one way or another a student, but a quarter were professionals in one way or another, practitioners from different sorts of rural development and enterprise. And it's a fascinating day. This was not like the whole thing, this is like an experiment, a taster, is that we arrived to find that there was a kind of legacy plan for that part of the region, which is what planners do, city planning with buildings and roads and a kind of what they call here a facility layout. Here are facilities. That is what traditional planning throughout the last 100 years has understood, buildings, roads, hard infrastructure. The design harvest approach is to say, we're not competing with with that. We are doing care zones, services, interactions and relationships which put into the spaces between those buildings and hard things, social and ecological activity, which is not there at the moment. And so in an incredibly small amount of time, we had groups that looked at open kitchens, relationships between the farmers and the market, food waste opportunities. One group found a nursing home. There was a textile atelier with incredible, high quality now. These are there now, But we have a generation ahead, I'm quite not sure how it's going to unfold, in which we provide ecological and social qualities that are not going to be capable of traditional town planning to do. So the relationship between traditional planning and building things and the social and ecological life, that's where the design opportunity comes in. And the traditional town planners know very well that this is needed. Just as an aside, in the UK, the new head of the Royal Town Planning Institute is an ecologist. And this is something everybody says, what on earth is going on? But this is like a very 300-year-old organization has appointed an ecologist to be in charge of the town planning profession in the UK. But what I then have done to this picture, I've added the job titles of people who were in that one-day meeting, who are the professionals. There was somebody who described herself as a countryside CEO. Somebody else was called a rural learning center principal. There was a rural project coordinator. There was an elder carer, a teacher, a village host curator, a product manager. These are people working together with, in one way or another, design backgrounds. They were invited to come and share this discussion. And I think that we had a most fascinating 15 minutes of the last 2 or 3 years was with 2 of those people when I said, I have the job of persuading a room full of skeptical people that there is work for them to do in this revitalizing the rural economy. And they said, they're both rather different from each other. They badly need people with the skills that designers have in very other contexts. Product managers, project leaders, people who bring together in a commercial environment or in a municipal environment, getting projects done. That's what designers do. They want people like that to use those skills in the countryside. I said, well, do we have to train all these people how to do that work? They said, well, frankly, it's not easy to imagine how we would train people to do what we do. We've learned by doing it. But then I just then said, well, how many jobs are we talking about? So this is where I give you a special bonus from my 50. There are roughly 1 million villages in China, or so I discovered. Each one, according to that discussion, will at some point need its own designer to help it develop. I can't prove this statistic, I'm just telling you, because I promised you jobs. And I want to end on how to think about this moving forwards, because normally what people say, I want a method, I want a chart, I want a canvas. I thought the best way to kind of draw this to a conclusion would be to compare the way that Steve Jobs described his life building the world's most valuable company. And he said, ultimately, it comes down to good taste. Expose yourself to the best things that humans have done, then try to bring those things into what you're doing. So I think he's qualified to have an opinion about what good taste in the Apple era was. I like to think that we can go better than that. The design harvest era. Ultimately, it comes down to good taste, the beauty of the web of life, the value of local knowledge and culture, and the best things that humans have done. Bring those qualities together into what you're doing. That, I think, describes for me what the design harvest journey is about, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Could you imagine, while listing these various options of alternative careers to what probably most people think most designers are going to do and be trained for, do you believe that maybe people here in the room risk to perish because they may not know these alternative avenues? They miss out on options that are maybe consciously or unconsciously are left out from the current discourse. So if that could be a risk they are running, is your speech actually also like an encouragement to just at least make excursions out of let's say the usual trajectory? Well, that was question.
So what Professor Baumann is saying, agree with me or perish, I think is what he said. No, of course, I think I have described opportunities that people have made happen for themselves. You will not find any of these jobs listed on jobs boards. Most of your parents will be deeply skeptical and difficult if you say, I'm going to become a river restorer, or I'm going to do social farming, because they say, is that a serious career? All I can do is say to you that for other people it is serious work. They have found ways to get paid for doing it. But we're in the middle of a transition. Do you know the expression that the new will be born from the ruins of the old? It's something from the Wobblies in the 1920s. We are right in the middle of the old system degrading in different ways, and out of this kind of wreckage that has been left behind by the industrial age are 1,000,001 shoots. So how you make a job out of that, I can't spoon feed that to you, but I'm just telling you that I've been, said at the beginning, traveling around the world a lot. I see people doing this stuff. So if you relate to it, you are going to have to go and do some exploration of where you live or where you're fancy working, and I more or less can promise you that you will find people doing it. I cannot promise you will find a paid job or a 20-year career structure, but there just seems to me definitely the case that the opportunities are out there. Did you have a second question?
Yeah, but maybe this already inspires some others.
Who wants my mic? I have been known to just give it to people randomly, so I have been known to just give it to people randomly, and then people have to say something, even the ones looking downwards. Sir, do you have a question?
Yes. Yes, I got some inspiration from the last questions. So my question maybe is like, if I can't find a job in the markets like that, I want to be a beginner. So what should I do? Only the thing that I can imagine is that I create a business like that to run it. Is that right? Or
great question, because I disagree with that. I think that we've all been kind of trained. We must start our own business, and the whole agri-tech world is people saying, farmers need robots to do their work, we'll start a business. I actually think that's about the worst thing you could do, because you have a small chance of succeeding. I think you could look around for existing organizations that are already there in the rural situation. I call them anchor institutions, a school, a hospital, a factory, anywhere that is saying, what do we do to kind of move forward? We're stuck. Say that I'm a designer, would you be interested in working with me to explore some new opportunities? That's what designers are trained how to do, to explore new possibilities. And so a library is a great example. Libraries have contact with local people, and they have a great deal of knowledge about who knows what and who's doing what. If you could find a library, start with a library. If you could find a town hall, a municipal office, find out who in that office may be trying to do things differently. I can tell you a story about this from my Saint-Étienne project in France. I spent 6 months trying to locate people who were doing projects about the river, and the town hall and the mayor and all these people, no, it's long gone, the river is dead, we buried it 50 years ago. And then after 6 months, a young woman came to me and said, hey, come with me. And she showed me this book, a paper sort of album filled with press cuttings and photographs and stories about people that she'd met over 2 or 3 years who were doing local projects on the river, planting a garden, cleaning up a bit of space for the children, putting in a tree. Something like 40 or 50 projects she had in her album, none of which were known by the town hall, which is in charge of the river. So that was such a lesson for me, is do not take no for an answer. Somebody out there is doing the work that maybe you can connect with. It doesn't answer the question of getting a job, but she was working for the town hall in administration. There are people out there, and she said, my boss really wants to do more river work, but he doesn't think it's possible. So I was able, because I was the outside person, I took her album, showed it to the mayor. He said, what? This is all happening here? And then he put a team together of people to start supporting those micro projects. So it's to do with connecting bits that are often there, but often hidden, often invisible. And don't take no for example, it's a good starting point.